Hey guys, it's Alex, and I am back with my July wrap up. It's really hard not to say June. I've said June about 4 times already. Despite only having 2 books in my hand, I did read 9 books. They all just happened to be library books, so they have been returned. But thankfully, I do have my handy dandy notebook with all the books that I've read. The first book I read this month was Winter Girls by Laurie House Anderson. I gave this book 3 out of 5 stars. I actually listened to the audiobook and I didn't read this copy, but I thought the audiobook was actually pretty poorly done, and I'd probably rate that like 2 out of 5 stars. But the book itself was a 3-star read for me. This is a YA contemporary about a teenage girl with an eating disorder, and I do think Laurie House Anderson is a wonderful writer, but I don't think the eating disorder representation was necessarily healthy for someone who does struggle with body image issues. And for that reason, I really wouldn't recommend this book to anyone who struggles with it, although I do think it might be a worthwhile read if you're trying to understand what it's like to be in the head of someone with an eating disorder. I do have a full review on this, so feel free to go check that out if you are interested. The second book I read this month was Second Life by S.J. Watson. This is an adult thriller. I gave it 2 out of 5 stars. It's about a woman whose sister has been murdered and basically her quest to discover what really happened, and she sort of falls down a dark hole with a man she meets online and having an affair. It's not the worst book I've ever read. It only got 2 stars because the main character engaged in a lot of rape fantasy play, which made me very uncomfortable, and I didn't think the characters were particularly well developed. I did enjoy S.J. Watson's other book, Before I Go to Sleep, much more, so if the premise intrigues you, I would suggest checking out that first, and then maybe Second Life, because I do think there is an audience of people who would enjoy Second Life. I don't think it was the worst book written, but I also don't think it was a particularly great thriller. Next, I read Making the Run by Heather Hinson. This is a contemporary young adult novel about a girl from a small town who's a photographer, and all she dreams about is someday escaping and going to a city somewhere, anywhere, as long as it's not this small town. She has a strained relationship with her father, and her mother died when she was very young. The book follows her quest as she finishes up her final year of high school. I gave this 3 out of 5 stars. If you've read any young adult contemporary written between 2000 and 2005, I feel like you've read this book. It was very generic early 2000s YA contemporary. I was hoping that the writing style would be a little bit more artsy and experimental, but honestly, it just wound up being pretty bland and I didn't feel much. I thought the book was fine. It didn't have any real flaws. I didn't have many issues with it, apart from the fact that the main romance was between a 28-year-old man and the 18-year-old main character, and they had sex on her 18th birthday, which I found really creepy, but I do think that wasn't particularly badly done. It just made me uncomfortable to read. I didn't do a full review on this, even though I usually do full reviews on the books I read, just because this book was fine. I have very little to say about it, and I'm honestly putting it in an unhaul pile just because I know I'm never going to read it again or really think about it again. And then I read The Way I Used to Be by Amber Smith, which is another young adult contemporary novel about a girl who was raped by her brother's best friend, and it follows her 4 years of high school after that. I found this book really heart-wrenching and really hard to read, but I also loved it. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars, and it's a book that I will read again, and I really do want to get my own copy because it really touched me. But I do think the book was not the best written. It felt a little bit shallow and a little bit melodramatic at points, and I do think the only reason I rated it as highly as I did was because I related so much to the main character, and that perhaps if you don't wind up relating that much to the main character, its flaws will be much more apparent and much more troublesome, and I do understand why it has as many negative reviews as it does. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend it, but I also wouldn't dissuade anyone from reading it if you are interested. One thing I really enjoyed about that book was that so often the narrative of rape victims is that they're incredibly sympathetic characters, and the fact that Eden wasn't very nice, she didn't react or cope in ways that made you feel particularly bad for her, because she took it out on other people, and she just wasn't a very likable person. And I did like that was done. I just don't know if it was done particularly well, and I would really like to read another book that does a similar thing that might be more well written. And then I read The Giver by Lois Lowry. I think most people have read this book. It is a middle grade dystopian novel about a boy growing up in a community who's waiting for his ceremony of 12 when he will be assigned his job. It's a utopian community, but as the book goes along, you and the main character Jonas sort of realize that it's not as perfect as it seems, and there are a lot of fundamental flaws within the community. It's a really beautiful, simple story, and I know so many people have read it, and I gave it 4 stars. The only reason it didn't hit 5 stars for me was because I did think it could be a little bit too simple at times, but it's such a beautiful story, and I would highly recommend this to anyone and everyone, regardless of what genres you usually read. It's just so wonderful. And after I finished The Giver, I decided to read the rest of the series because I never had finished the whole series. And that started with the second book, which was Gathering Blue by Lois Lowry. I also gave this 4 out of 5 stars. I actually originally read this in middle school before I read The Giver, because they do work as standalones. This is set in the same world, but a very different community, and the main character is Kira, a teenage girl whose mother has just died. She's disabled and has a twisted leg, so she has to fight for her life in this community because they often allow people with disabilities to be killed, or they just abandon them because they're seen as weak. She has a gift with weaving and thread. She uses that gift the same way Jonas uses his. Not as good as The Giver, but I still think it's a very, very worthwhile read, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. The third book in the series is Messenger, which follows a character from Gathering Blue, Maddie, as he too has a gift, as most of the people in these books do. I gave this book 3 out of 5 stars. I didn't think it lived up to either The Giver or Gathering Blue. It just wasn't as good, and I didn't enjoy it as much, and the ending just made me angry and made me not want to continue the series. But I did continue with Sun, which is the 4th and final book, and I also gave it 3 stars. It was a fine book, but it wound up being really disappointing as the series finale. I think if it had just been a standalone with that plot, I would have enjoyed it perfectly fine, but as it was the last book, I expected more from it than it offered. It had its own plot and its own story, but I did expect it to wrap up some of the unanswered questions from the previous 3 books, which it really didn't do at all. It was just a separate story, which all 4 of the books were. So I didn't really enjoy the series aspect of The Giver, but I do think Lois Lowry is a wonderful author. So if you can look at these books as standalones, I maybe would recommend reading the series. But if you're looking for it to be a series the way I was, it wound up being very disappointing, and I really don't think anything other than the first 2 books was worth reading. And the 9th and final book I read this month was Do No Harm by Henry Marsh, which I had been trying to read for about the last month and a half. It took me an incredibly long time. This is a medical memoir written by a neurosurgeon about his career in the medical profession. I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. I did think it was very well written, and he did a very good job of making this book accessible to people who don't have a background in neurosurgery. I know nothing about neurosurgery apart from McDreamy on Grey's Anatomy, and I could still understand what he was talking about, so that was wonderfully done, and the book was very well written. It was just very graphic and detailed about the medical procedures themselves, which I was not as fond of. I'm not squeamish about that, although if you are, here's a warning for that, it's very graphic. But I did find that it dragged for me because of those reasons, and it just felt a little bit boring. But I did still think it was a good book and a worthwhile read, and I'm very glad I read it. Overall, this month was a lot better than last month. I had mostly 3-star reads with a couple of 4-star reads thrown in, and only 1 2-star, so I was pretty happy with it, because I am very picky when it comes to books, so my ratings tend to be more on the neutral side, just because it takes a lot for me to really feel attached to a book. Let me know down below if you've read any of these books. I do have reviews up for most of them, so if you would like to check out the review, you can head on over to my channel, and I have a lot of those. I try to do at least 1 a week. Let me know what some of your favorite reads were from this month. I always like to hear from you guys and hear what you're reading. And for those of you that are used to my channel and my schedule, I'm not going to have a reading vlog this week. I'm just going to have double next week because I didn't have enough time to film all the videos I wanted. So we're gonna do it like this so I don't wind up having 6 or 7 videos in 1 week because that feels excessive. Bye guys!